Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Bull City Coordinators Duke Football Coverage Podcast. Follow us on our website, bullcitycoordinators.com. Check us out on Twitter at Duke FB Coverage. We're on all the socials. I just got on Blue Sky. I'll send my invite code to you when I get it. If you want to get on there, send us an email, bullcitycoordinators@gmail.com. Our direct messages on Twitter are open. And, of course, why don't you call in, leave us a voicemail, 540-632-0160, and you can get on the podcast, which we have one voicemail now from Jason Rogers, which we will listen to.
Hey, Ben. I just want to call and give my prediction and a little recap on the game this past Saturday. I believe most of the fans are probably a little bit more disappointed than the coaching staff and the players. They probably handle losses better than we do as fans. But anyway, that was a heartbreaker for the guys. But we gotta move on. We got another top 25 team ranked in the nation. We're gonna win one of these again this year. I guarantee that. But anyway, that being said, I'll throw my prediction out there. Did not copycat your dad. Actually, I had this in my mind before he gave his prediction, but I guess that old saying is great minds think alike. But I'm also going to go with 24-14. Duke wins 24-14, and I do have a question this week. With Duke being known as great medical school, do you think Duke uses that as a recruiting tool? I.e., with Riley Leonard coming back, most schools would have probably not got him back as quick on the medical side. And then Daniel Jones years ago when he broke his collarbone. I think they scientifically made something to help him out as he was playing, but just curious in your conversations with former players, is this used as a recruiting tool that, hey, we're up on all the medical programs in the nation. You get hurt, we can bring you back a little bit quicker. And as always, go Duke, and thank you for all your hard work you do for us as fans. Bye-bye.
Well, thank you so much, Jason, for calling in. I really appreciate it. And as you'll find out, I didn't really take the time to thoroughly prepare for the call with Conor like I normally do. So I neglected to ask him the question you asked about recruiting. And somehow I totally whiffed on that. But that is a great question. But before I get into that, obviously your comment about the game being heartbreaking could apply to either of the last two that we've seen from the Blue Devils. It's just unfortunate. Now, I'm going to withhold a comment on great minds thinking alike for you and my dad here. It's just too easy of a shot to take at the old man, so I'm going to pass on it. But as for the recruiting, I think it would have to be something that would come into play. None of the prior staff have mentioned, or excuse me, none of the prior players have ever mentioned that was a big selling point, but I'm sure it would have to come up at some level of, hey, if you do need medical treatment, you're going to have the best care of any team in the ACC, arguably. I think that Duke Medicine is obviously a world-class institution. It's a great place, and I'm sure those kind of stories do stick in the recruits' minds and when they're trying to make a decision. And I'll tell you what, remind me, don't ever let me forget this, but the next time Conor comes on, if he ever wants to come back on, I'll ask him about it and see what we can find out. But I remember David Cutcliffe made a joke about it when he took the job at Duke because he had those cardiac issues. And he said, hey, at least I know I'm going to get world-class medical care or something like that. So certainly I think it would come into play at some level. And hopefully we've got guys who are smart enough to think on the recruiting trail to say, hey, you're going to get great medical care. And the guys that we're recruiting at Duke are very smart, and they're going to say, hey, I know if I'm hurt, I'm going to get top-notch care. Just another reason that everybody out there should strongly, strongly consider coming to Duke. Thanks a lot for continuing to call in, and I am very sorry that I didn't get everything together the way that I normally do for the Louisville game, or for the interview with Conor, I mean, just after the Louisville game, I just was a little out of sorts. But hopefully, both me, Duke fans, and the team and coaching staff will all be ready to go against Wake Forest. Thanks again for calling in. And as always, go Duke.
Thank you, Jason, for calling in. Sorry that the Louisville game did not turn out the way that we all hoped. Unfortunately, that happens from time to time, and we're going to get into that here in just a minute. One thing, though, that I do want to get into is doing the podcast the way that I have been doing it, bringing on people who cover the opposing teams. I have a great opportunity now to bring a guy who not only covers the opposing team, but our team. Our next guest is a publisher for both Devils and Deacons Illustrated. He co-hosts the Big J and Little J podcast, which I've added to my Wednesday schedule. Enjoy it very much. And he is a voter for the Heisman and for the Bolitnikoff. Conor O'Neill, how are you, sir?
All right. It's the time of year where I get overwhelmed, not just because I have a Super Bowl feeling of a game to cover, but basketball ramps up, and it's like you kind of wish there were 36-hour days instead of 24-hour days. You know what I mean?
I understand completely. And this weekend had to be an odd one for you. I think you tweeted something about how poorly the two teams did offensively. And so why don't we just get right into that a little bit. First, thank you for coming back on the podcast. I appreciate it. You're a great source for information, and I enjoy listening to your podcast and also following you online. Why don't we start with Wake Forest? That's a team that the Blue Devils would play regularly, but maybe haven't followed quite as closely this year as they would in prior years. Tell us how Wake Forest is doing right now.
Yeah, it's a struggle. They're 4-4, 1-3 in the ACC, I believe it is. They're searching for some answers, mostly on offense. It's really the toughest pill to swallow for Wake right now is if you take the level of play their defense has given them this year and pair that with any offensive production they've had for the last 6 years, you've got a double-digit win team on your hands, all the rankings, and you can really start thinking about how high the ceiling is because they've been inconsistent on defense for so long, and this year they finally found it. Year two of a defensive coordinator with Brad Lambert. They've gotten really good linebacker play, and they've got two really good safeties, an NFL corner in Kalen Carson. So they've really broken through on that side of the ball. The tough part of it is their offense is just in shambles. They had a miscalculation on quarterback. I think that's the nicest way I can phrase it at this point. They thought Mitch Griffiths in his fourth year in the program and first year as a starter after Sam Hartman's departure would be better. They thought the offense around him would be better. They thought the system would work in some of the same ways that it's worked for years, and none of that has happened. And it's spelled a lot of I don't know. It's tough to say. Like I get where the frustration comes from. I also think that Wake has been a little spoiled with solid quarterback play. This is Dave Clawson's 10th year, and he basically had 4 years of mostly John Wolford, some Kendall Hinton, with one emergency start in 4 years by a third stringer. Then he had there were basically 2 years in 2018-19 when it was either Sam Hartman or Jamie Newman, two really good college quarterbacks. One of them became the ACC's all-time touchdown passer. And then the last 3 years were just Sam. Other than one emergency medical situation start last year, it was all Sam Hartman. And when you take it a step further, the last 8 years of Jim Grobe were all Riley Skinner to Tanner Price. And Tanner Price is kind of the forgotten guy, but he was a 4-year starter. He was a solid quarterback. He just kind of like their story this year. He didn't have pieces around him to really make it work. So, I get it. You think that position is going to be good for you when you have that kind of stability. And this year it's not come to fruition for them. And it's one of many problems.
Let me ask you a little bit about maybe what we're seeing at Wake Forest, because obviously they have a fantastic coach in Dave Clawson. I mean, he's I don't want to say he's really good because I feel like that's selling him short, but he's really good at what he does. Let me ask you though, what we saw in the Jim Grobe era, you mentioned the end of his time there, but they got to where they were, I think, yeah, they won the conference title under Grobe in 2006, and then there started to be this kind of decline, and then the team bottomed out. Now, Clawson won the Atlantic, won the division, played in the championship game, lost to Pitt. We could probably spend some time talking about what's going on with Pitt that I don't want to get into now. We'll save that for later. Jeez. But we've seen some decline as well. Even last year, they took a pretty, I don't want to say far step, but they took a decent sized step backwards from where they had been in 2021. Is this just kind of what maybe, and I think Blue Devil fans will probably have to expect some of this too, kind of what you should expect? You're going to have that one really, really good season, and it's going to take you some time to kind of get back to that.
Yeah, I think so. I think, look, man, I work for a recruiting based website. I'm the first to say that you should not pay attention to recruiting rankings that much. Once it gets past like the top 500 to 750 prospects, once you get into that 3-star tier and below, it's all just a crapshoot, and it all depends on so many other factors other than a guy's measurables and 40 times and all the athleticism numbers. It goes so far beyond that. But I do think when you recruit at that level, like when you're not bringing in the top 25 classes, when you're relying on developing your own guys, if you miss on a class or two, if you stack some misses, you might not see it initially, but you're going to see it eventually, kind of without fail. And when you look at Wake's 2019 class, the class that should be fifth-year guys that should be the leaders of your program, you're kind of stretching to find who the playmakers on this team are from that class. And the transfer portal should be able to cover some gaps in that what I'm talking about. But then you talk about Wake's haul in the transfer portal this year. I mean, their best offensive player in the portal came from Tennessee, and he's a receiver. He hasn't played for the last 2 weeks, and when he was in there in the first 6 games, he wasn't doing much. Walker Merrill. Their best transfer on the defensive side of the ball has been Jacob Roberts, and he was a linebacker from North Carolina A&T. They got a defensive tackle from Villanova, Bryce Ganius, who's been really good. Those are 2 FCS guys. Their corner, who's played some, DeMarcus Rankin, came from Notre Dame. Not that Notre Dame. It was Notre Dame College, which is a D2 in Texas that I didn't even know existed until he committed to Wake. So you're not, it goes all into collect the what Wake's NIL picture is, what their collective is. They had a late start in the NIL game, and so that's kind of limited Wake's ability to close the gaps and make up for some recruiting misses that are winding up kind of biting them in the ass right now.
I've spent a lot of time thinking about this because I spent too much time looking at conference restructuring issues when they came up. And part of me thinks being Wake Forest and Duke in a conference with NC State and North Carolina is going to make it hard no matter what, particularly when you get to football. But let's talk about, let's talk about the challenges Wake has, not just immediately with recruiting and with NIL. I think we're all familiar with that. But let's talk about the challenges that they've got on their schedule. They've got 4 games left, just like the Blue Devils. Obviously, there's a matchup Thursday night. But then after that, you've got NC State, Notre Dame, and Syracuse. Okay. The last two were on the road. And in fact, 3 of the last 4 are on the road for Wake. Wake's 4-4 right now. What do you project outward for Wake Forest?
I kind of think they've got to get one of the next two. A couple of weeks ago, I would have told you they'd been really up against it to win at Duke. Now, with what Duke's offenses looked like for the last 2 weeks and the uncertainty of not just the quarterback position, but of their two best offensive linemen in Jacob Monk and Graham Barton, I would say Thursday night is kind of a toss-up game. NC State going to Winston-Salem is always going to be a toss-up game, I think, no matter what the record is, because I think it's NC State has won one game in Winston-Salem in something like 24, 22 years. It's one of those crazy things where no matter how good or bad one of them is, and vice versa, the other, it's always this weird, kooky game when State goes to Winston.
Yeah, and State just beat Clemson, which could mean the rest of the season's going to be a disaster. That would be the most Dave Doran thing possible.
Right. I think Steve Smith will probably show up and put a hex on them. I have a hard time seeing Wake Forest going to Notre Dame and winning on Sam Hartman Senior Day Part 2. And so I think you're looking at a 5-6 Wake team if they're able to get one of their next two that goes into the dome, and that might be 5-6 Wake against 5-6 Syracuse at that point. And let's just have a battle of attrition to see which of them has more depth and can win a game and be bowl eligible and go to Boston on December 23rd or whatever that bowl game is, whatever the lowest in the ACC pecking order is.
I think it is going to be an interesting end to the schedule for Notre Dame. To your point, I think we all thought differently about the Duke game until just recently, but NC State certainly could be a win for Wake Forest. Syracuse also, you look at that as a win, I think. Notre Dame definitely lost unless something crazy happens. Like, they don't have enough people on the field. Who would think something like that could happen, right? But let's talk about the one that's coming up that we've got on Thursday. What is going on with the Blue Devils?
It's tough, man. I mean, you play 20 games under Mike Elko, and if there's one common thread between all 20 of those games, it's that Duke was going to play physical and hold their own at the point of attack. They were at least going to make it a push on the line of scrimmage, if not win the line of scrimmage. And they won the line of scrimmage most games they played. And that 21st game at Louisville, I mean, none of that was true at all. The thread snapped right there. They got physically dominated up front. They came out flat, which I was not expecting at all. And just, it happens. I mean, you can't just say it happens and shrug it off. Like, it's a loss that probably, it definitely removes destiny from your control as far as getting that rematch against FSU in Charlotte on December 2nd. But more than anything, it casts some doubt on the rest of the season. I mean, you're going into November now, 5-3, and I think there's another win in there. This is certainly a team that's not just thinking about being bowl eligible, though, and that's where you throw in the December 23rd Fenway joke for this team. So I think they need to regroup. It's easier to regroup when you don't have to come back from a road game and then have 3 days to prepare, basically, is what it amounts to before you're ready to play a game on a Thursday night. But that's the breaks.
Yeah, and we could talk about the schedule. This was a part, and honestly, I didn't normally have a pretty detailed outline together. I could not bring myself to put one together, so I am riffing it a little bit. But here is kind of what I thought about the performance of the game. And you mentioned destiny, and I always like to remind people the funny thing about destiny is people say you can control your own destiny, but you actually can't. Destiny is an event that will necessarily happen. Okay. Yeah. So, but to your point, the control now, this was a big game, right? The Louisville game was a big game. You got one loss in conference. If you can beat Louisville, you've got a clear path ahead of you that if you do everything you need to do, and you're looking at the way North Carolina has turned out to play these last 2 weeks, a game I stopped watching last night, I thought they were going to run the Yellow Jackets out of the building. But look, this was a chance the Blue Devils had to win. I was watching it here by myself. Granted, I'd had my flu shot the day before. I felt a little wonky, so maybe I was misreading stuff. I don't think that film session is going to be good for the defense. And let me explain why. And you can tell me if I remember this wrong. It looked like there were a lot of shoulder tackling, a lot of arm tackling, a lot of upper body trying to tackle, not getting the waist, not wrapping up, not going to tackle the legs like Jeremy Cash was so good at. I mean, he could find your ankle anywhere and bring you down, right? I'm sitting there watching it saying, what are we doing? And then when Elko went for it on that fourth down early, I said in my mind, I have never seen Elko act desperate. This looks desperate. And then you call about the worst play you could ever run in that situation, which is the quarterback's in the gun. Okay. And it just seemed like the whole team just came out. And to your point, it happens. Sometimes it's not your night. I said that on Twitter repeatedly, and I think this is a good staff. They'll get over it. But I mean, I know there were some injuries that happened, but to me, it just seemed like the whole team just got overwhelmed by the moment or something, which is so odd for them. I mean, did you get that sense watching it?
Yeah, it was a flat performance. I mean, Jamion Franklin was honest with us afterward. Jordan Moore gave us a little bit of it, but it was really Elko and Jamion hitting home with calling it what it was. It was flat. They didn't see it coming. I mean, I always get reminded when you ask them if did you see this coming? Well, like if they saw it coming, they would have probably done something to avoid it and not let it happen. But yeah, to go back to your tackling thing, I'm a little bit of I'm at a handicap too because I only watched. I got back from covering the Florida State Wake game about a few minutes left in the first half, so a lot of the damage had already been done. When I saw it, it was already a 2-touchdown deficit, and I took it as Duke is trying to force turnovers any way they can, and that's why you've got DBs ripping the ball instead of getting the ball on the ground. And that's something that you don't want to have happen, but it's something that in the game script and the game flow, when your defense is down 2 scores, they think they need to get the ball back for the offense. They think they have to give them good field position. That's going to happen more often. It's part of what Elko talks to us all the time about with chasing points and chasing the game. That happens when the other team's ripping off 8 to 10 yards every time they hand it to the running back. So it's not, I'm not making excuses for it. I'm just trying to that's one thing happens. And then that leads to the poor tackling that I saw at least.
Well, one thing, as somebody who has spent way too much time listening to now 2 Roman history podcasts at once and is reading a book that a friend of mine loaned me called Rubicon, The Last Years of the Roman Republic by Tom Holland. One thing that I've always noticed about how you win sometimes is you just don't get beaten, meaning you strategically retreat and allow for a regroup. And when you start stripping at the ball, it's like when generals attack before they're ready. Okay. Or they don't choose the right ground. They get forced into it. They don't have the advantage. They don't have the initiative. I felt like we were doing a lot of that. And that's where it really comes back on the coaches to just say, stop, just play within the system. And it just seemed like when Elko went forward on that fourth down, it just felt like this is going to be a day of panic and desperation. And that's kind of the way it played out. One thing, though, that I want to ask you about, having interviewed a lot of the older Duke football guys, one thing that they always mentioned to me was depth is always going to be an issue for the Blue Devils. That's what we're seeing this year. Where are we? I know it's Sunday, so it's way, way too early, but what can you tell us, if anything, about the injury report for Thursday?
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you that it's a lot easier to come back on bulky ankle when you have a full week instead of only having 5 days. It doesn't take being in the meeting room with Elko and the medical staff to know that part of it. Riley Leonard was able to come back from the Florida State game to the Louisville game in part because he had a full week. Now you just slice 2 of those days off. It's going to be a little tougher for him to get back. And I know most people had probably turned it off or muted it or gone and done literally anything else. But right there at the end of the game when Grayson Loftus was in there, I can't remember, Sean McDonough, I think, mentioned during the game on ESPN that the staff had told him if they went to a backup quarterback behind Riley Leonard, it would not be Henry Beelan, it would be Grayson Loftus. And that tells you about Henry Beelan's availability. Like, Henry Beelan didn't do anything to get himself benched to the third string. I mean, it's early and we're not going to really know in earnest until it's warm-ups on Thursday evening, but there's a non-zero chance that Duke is starting true freshman Grayson Loftus in this game. That's just something that's a possibility to be aware of at this point. It's one thing to go out there and beat NC State when you hold them to 300 yards and 3 points, and you have the one play that Henry Beelan has to hit, and he hits on the double move. The one play where you get an interception and start on their 8-yard line and go out there and have a one-play drive for 8 yards and a touchdown. Like, that's one thing to ask a first-time starter to do. It's another thing to throw a true freshman out there on Thursday night and do it against another ACC team. So, I mean, that's the thing to keep an eye on. Offensive line, like, it surprised me Graham Barton was out. I didn't know he was dealing with anything. Jacob Monk going down. Like, again, it's one thing to go into the Notre Dame game knowing you're not going to have Graham Barton and sliding Brian Parker II over there, and you've still got the 4 other positions secured. It's another thing when you remove the best 2. And Graham Barton and Jacob Monk are the best 2 offensive linemen on this team. You take away both of them, you're talking about a lot of sliding pieces and mismatches. And I mean, like I put on the board earlier today, offensive line depth was the main concern coming out of fall camp for a reason. That wasn't just making up something to be concerned about. Like, they had the 2 kids that went through spring ball and then transferred at the end of spring ball. Those were supposed to be their pieces that are in there right now, and they're not. So you're talking about, instead of your 6th and 7th guys that you exited spring ball with are at other schools and they're starting. And now you've got who you exited spring ball with thinking were going to be your 8th and 9th guys who now have to be those 6th and 7th guys. So it's a tough spot. And when you remove 2 starters with Barton and Monk, the 6th and 7th guys become your 4th and 5th guys. It's just the pecking order there of offensive line depth. That's tough to overcome.
And I think that leads into what I wanted to ask you about next, because you mentioned this with having to start Loftus. I actually thought in the spring game Loftus looked better than Beelan. That being said, true freshman going up against Dave Clawson, not crazy about that. But the offense just has not looked the same this year as it did last year. And you mentioned this on your last podcast, which was that it seems like the offense is missing Eli Pankel a lot. And you said more than you thought. And I think we both expected more production from some of the other guys behind Eli to step up, but it just hasn't happened. Do you have any other idea as far as what's been wrong with the offense? I mean, we've seen Riley misplace a lot of balls, not click on the deep ball. Any thoughts on what the issue there is?
Yeah, I mean, I think you kind of have to take Mike Elko at his word. That guy's forgotten more about football than I know. He's not just the defensive savant who has no idea what's going on with the offense. And so when he tells you that they're out of sync and out of rhythm in the passing game. That's his honest opinion on the matter. They've got some timing issues. They've got some separation issues, and if they had the guys that could do that, they'd be in there. So, it's tough, right? Like I thought receiver would be a strength of this team. I thought Samir Hagens, coming off of a strong finish, would be able to parlay that into being a consistent player for this team. Thought they knew what they had with Jalen Calhoun, and Jordan Moore. I thought they would take steps forward, and I think it's fair to say at this point, I mean, there's 4 games left plus a possible bowl. They might get back to that point, but I think they've taken steps back from last year, at least where they were production wise. And that's where, you put in the caveat, like, this team runs the ball for 200 yards a game. You don't have to throw the ball a ton if you are that reliant on your rush game. They ran the ball to beat Clemson. They ran the ball to beat the next 2 non-conference games. At UConn, they had to throw it a bunch and did it kind of well. And we really haven't seen much success in the throw game since then. But I've been kind of surprised that the receiver group hasn't stepped up more. They miss Eli Pankel. There's no doubt about that. I didn't think they would miss him this much, though. Like, I thought they would be able to kind of compensate for him in other ways, and the other ways have been with the rushing game. It's not really been with anybody in the receivers room or tight end room, for that matter, stepping up.
Yeah, and I can't figure out. I know Dal Mullen's out, but it's not like we were really getting him the ball a lot beforehand. I just don't get why we're not trying to utilize those guys more. And at least would help your blocking some, having them in there to chip or move one back as a makeshift fullback, something like that. Now, again, to echo what you said, Coach Johns and Elko know more about football and have forgotten more about it than I will ever know. You're looking at it and you can see a team that's out of sync a little bit, and it seems like maybe the solution should be going back to a little bit more simplified kind of basic stuff. Obviously, you want to run the ball because you can do it and you've got guys who can do it, but the unfortunate part is you got to turn around on Thursday night and get these guys ready to go. But one thing I want to ask you about is we've seen Leonard play. He was out for NC State, comes back against Florida State. He has not looked particularly great, in large part, I think, because of that ankle. I mean, part of me is saying maybe we should have just kept him out against Florida State, try to bring him back 100% healthy against Louisville. But that's easy to Monday morning quarterback, and seeing how poorly the offense has done at times, I can understand why they wanted to bring him back. But do you have any thoughts on that at all?
Yeah, I mean, it's just so hard for me to sit here and say that they should have held him out against Florida State. I don't know how much better the ankle can get with another week. I kind of think an ankle sprain like that, it's not going to be good until he gets a month to just ice it, just not do anything on it. You're not going to get that in a season. They got fortunate with the off week being where it was, and they still could only get him back to a certain point with the off week and missing a game. So I don't know. I don't know what an extra week would have given him that you don't already have.
Yeah, and I think I'm just asking that question to ask it. I don't think there's really a winnable solution for Elko and the staff in that situation, because you want Leonard to play and you want to do everything you can to get him to play because your team is its best when he is playing. The balance is, well, what if we bring him back too soon? Does he get hurt again? I mean, it's there's no good solution there for Elko and the staff. It's just a tough one. Here is one other thing, and I wanted to ask you about, and then we can talk about kind of what do you think is going to happen on Thursday night, which is last year the offense seemed to really be built around Riley breaking a long play, putting in that Riley cheat code. And this year, he hasn't really been able to do it, I think, because the passing game hasn't been as effective. What is it going to take to get the Blue Devils back to the crisp offense that we thought we might see after last season? And is that maybe an illusion because of the schedule? I mean, all the losses that we've had have been to three good teams this year. Clemson turned out to be a little bit of a mess. I mean, what do you think it's going to take for the Blue Devils to get back to where they were offensively last year?
Yeah, I wouldn't sell the Clemson one short there because, I mean, still a talented roster, and they weren't the train wreck in that opener that they have been in the last couple of weeks. Yeah, I I don't know if it clicks, if everything clicks into rhythm all of a sudden for this offense. There's no midseason acquisition. There's no trade deadline. There's no like, I had this kind of thought pop up into my head, like, okay, like Duke has 4 games plus postseason left. Now you can play all your freshmen that you haven't played all year, right? Like, and they can retain their red shirts. Well, that all sounds good in theory, but if those guys were good enough to get snaps in front of the guys that have been getting snaps for the first 8 games, they would have gotten snaps. It's not like you just hold your best players out of games that you're trying to win and trying to compete for an ACC championship. If those guys were good enough to play, they'd play. So it's not like reinforcements don't come in college football unless you get lucky with injury stuff and you have guys show up during a season, which, I mean, to spin things around to the other side that I cover real quick. I mean, Wake thought they were going to have some guys become available throughout a season, and like they're still without a starting linebacker that had a concussion late in fall camp. And it's concussion. You have no idea how long those symptoms are going to be. Some guys are back from it in a week, and this guy's missed 2 months of what should have been his senior season. So it's just I don't know if Duke's offense clicks back into what it was last year. I think it's just what can they piece together for this last month? Can they run the table and wind up 9-3? And if you do that, you at least give yourself a chance to get to Charlotte. It's not entirely in your control. You got to root for some upsets. Probably wind up rooting for Virginia Tech to beat Louisville, and then you then you root for Virginia Tech to lose because they're ahead of you in the loss column, and you like, I guess you would want the 3-way tie. I don't know. I looked at the tiebreaker situation in the ACC website the other day, and it gave me a headache just looking at it and trying to figure out what would happen in one scenario. So yeah,
I mean, here's the thing. I feel like I'm being overly critical. I'm not trying to be. I think really what we're going to have to see for Duke to get back is these guys are going to have to scheme. The coaching staff's just going to have to scheme out of their mind. I mean, they're going to have to come up with plays and really just be the masterful tacticians that I know they can be. And maybe it's just the team was having a letdown after the Florida State game. Who knows? Maybe that's all it is. But there have been some concerning elements all season about this and that, about, well, the deep ball's a little off. I mean, nobody other than Calhoun and Moore are stepping up, and that started to become more apparent when you play better teams. The good thing is we know that Elko can coach well. We know these guys are conditioned well. We know that Johns and the defensive guys can really, really put together some good schemes. So it's certainly possible that the Blue Devils could win out and go 9-3, or could go 8-4. I mean, this stretch that they're in now was, I think we all looked at the first 5 games of the season when it came out and said 3-2. Okay. This was the one that a lot of us were really worried about, right? Yeah. This was, how good's NC State going to be? How good's Florida State going to be? What are we going to get with Louisville, Carolina? I mean, this was one that we were all looking at saying, oh gosh, and Wake's never going to be a gimme. So I think kind of we're seeing what we all maybe expected at the beginning of the season. So why don't we do this so that, again, I don't want to sound overly negative, but we do need to talk about some of these issues and be fair about it. what do you think is going to happen on Thursday night? Give us your prediction for who do you think is going to win. Give us a score and your reasoning for it.
Oh man, I wasn't prepared to be giving predictions here. I think it's going to be low scoring. Like I said, like neither one of these programs is in a good place with the quarterback situation right now. So it's hard to see this being a what was the score when they played last year? 34-31, I think it was. And the
It was a
ball went up
wild
and down the
game.
field. Feel like at least one of the teams had over 500 yards, maybe both of them. I cannot see that happening. And part of that is because both of them play good defense. Like it's not all on offensive ineptitude. Duke, for their struggles in the last 2 weeks, they've played some really good defense. The flat start and the 2 touchdowns against Jawar Jordan and the offense not scoring overshadow the fact that they only gave up 3 field goals for the rest of the game. That's not a bad showing against a pretty potent Louisville offense. So I would go low scoring. I think Duke has a slight advantage. Wake struggles with turnovers. They didn't turn the ball over against Florida State, which is not all that alarming, even though it was such a lopsided game. Florida State both doesn't take the ball away from you and they don't give you the ball. They're really sound in the turnover department. I think they have less than 10 takeaways, but they only have like 3 or 4 giveaways all year. One of them was a Chandler Rivers pick 6 on the deflected pass. I don't know. I'll say 16-10 Duke wins. 1 touchdown for each, and Duke has a little bit of an advantage in the field position game and maybe the turnover game with a short field or 2. Wake is going to be interesting. Like Wake has gotten, like I've said, they've gotten bad quarterback play. The only ACC win was started by their 3rd string quarterback that all the Wake fans think should have started last week against yesterday against Florida State. I mean, the game they won against Pittsburgh, the playbook was I don't want to say dumbed down, but it was very limited. It was handoff right, handoff left, handoff up the middle. Did we get a first down? No. Okay, we're punting. They really didn't trust him to throw the ball until they had to in the 4th quarter. I don't know, man. This is I tend to think all Thursday night football games are ugly. NFL when they have even shorter rest. Colleges when they're on 5 days of rest. I think this game would be really ugly if it's on Saturday. Like I just think these teams are gonna get down in the mud. It's gonna be it's probably to a degree gonna be which one of them waiting out the other to see who makes a mistake first and who blinks. It's not gonna be pretty. I can promise you that.
Well, going into this, I was going to take Wake 13-10, and you worried me a little bit when you said Loftus may play, although I think Loftus can be a good quarterback in this system and could do well. And if there's no film on him, he may just surprise the heck out of Wake, and no one will know really how to contain him, which would be great. But the way that you talked about their offensive struggles, I'm going to flip that. I'm going to take Duke 13-10, even with Riley coming back. I think it's going to be just two. It's going to be like 2 boxers towards the end of a fight, just hitting each other until one of them falls down and doesn't get up in time, and they ring the bell. Especially the problems you're going to have too if Monk is out and Barton is out, and you've already got some issues with the guys who come in behind Monk and Barton not playing at that level, which is hard to do. I mean, those are 2 really, really good players. So when you look at that and the way the offense has just been a little bit off, although the running game's been very good, I have watched more Wake than I normally do. I've watched more of them this season. Their offense does look out of sorts, kind of worse. I would say it's worse than what we saw from the Blue Devils of late. I mean, although we haven't scored a point in 5 quarters. So to your point, I think it probably could just be a really ugly game, and it's a Thursday night game though, so watch it turn around and be like a shootout, like a 45-42 game, and we're all wondering why we didn't take the over, right? I mean, who knows? But I'm going to take the Blue Devils too. And then we're going to get a voicemail, check in with Richlandia. Sorry, Dad, that your preseason pick 10-2 won't work. So let's hear what you have to say now.
Well, hello again, everyone. Ben's dad here, calling from Richlandia. Quick look at the Deacons on a short turnaround for our Blue Devils, and maybe that'll be the best thing in the world for us to get Saturday's lack of performance out of our heads. But as Mike Krzyzewski once said, here's to never forgetting. Wake rolls in, averaging just over 22 points a game and giving up 24.5 points a game. They have 81 rushing first downs and 71 passing first downs on the season. Opponents have gotten 53 first downs on the ground and 82 through the air. The Deacons average 143 yards a game on the ground. They've scored 8 rushing touchdowns, and opponents average about 128 on the ground, and they've scored 7 rushing TDs against Wake Forest. Passing, they've had several quarterbacks who've had to step up and perform this season, but 132 out of 228 with 8 picks and 10 touchdowns, and they've given up 163 out of 267 and 6 picks to the opponents, who've got 13 touchdowns, or the opponents have thrown 6 interceptions. Excuse me. Total offense, Wake's averaging 344 a game, giving up 384. They average 36.5 yards in penalties a game. Benefit of the opponents have committed 77.3, helping Wake out quite a bit. Net punting average 40.4. They've outscored their opponents in the third and fourth quarters, 40 to 27 in the third and 60 to 53 in the fourth, but they've dug holes for themselves in the first half of most games. They've got 18 sacks for 113 yards, and opponents have gotten 36 sacks for 218 yards. Field goal kicker, 14 out of 16 on the season. Red zone trips, Wake's 25 out of 30 with 12 touchdowns. They're 0 for 3 on 2-point conversions. And Wake opponents have an 18 out of 24 number in the red zone with 10 touchdowns. The Deeks come in only 1-4 in the conference. So it's a big game for our Blue Devils. Leading rushers for them, Claiborne, 493 yards with 5 touchdowns, averaging a little over 61 yards a game. And Ellison, 425 yards and averaging just under 61 yards a game. Griffiths has been the main quarterback for them with 6 touchdown passes. 6 picks and 9 touchdown passes. Leading receivers, Banks with 42 catches, averages over 11 yards per catch, 3 touchdowns on the season. Morin with 28 catches, Grimes with 16, Williams with 24, with 2 and 1 touchdown respectively. Hyde has a couple of touchdowns with 9 receptions. Quick finish up on the report, taking a look at the ACC status of injured players for Wake Forest. Jones, a linebacker, is undergoing concussion protocol. Green at wide receiver with a knee injury, probably out for the season. Same with Ellis at tight end, an undisclosed injury, along with Stieg, a wide receiver who is questionable. Kern, quarterback, shoulder injury, out for the season. Sharp, an offensive lineman, an ankle injury, and Merrill, a foot injury, questionable status. So us, of course, we've got some people out. Dalmolin looks questionable, of course. Pancol probably out for the season. And we had second lineman go down, a guy, big tackle on the left side, of course, didn't start the game, and Monk went out with an injury. I haven't got an update there. Riley Leonard did a pretty good job, but he's obviously not 100%. And we got some people dinged up too, and a quick turnaround. And I'm just not going to predict this one. I'm a little disappointed that we are 5-3 at this point. And you have to wonder, going back, unfortunately, being unable to stop Notre Dame on that 4th down play would have prevented Riley probably from getting hurt. And you have to wonder where we would be at this point in the season. But Injuries are what they are. That was the caveat I gave at the beginning of the season. And I'm just hoping that we can turn things around against Wake Forest and still have a pretty good season with what everyone thought was going to be a really difficult schedule going in. But we need to go back and be Mike Elko, Duke football Thursday night instead of whoever the heck we were this past Saturday in Louisville. Go Devils.
All right. Thank you, Dad, for calling back in. Well, Conor, I got to tell you one story before I give you the open mic. One of the things that you have on your bio on Twitter tells everybody who is going to use the term student athlete to learn the story of Ray Dennison. My son has had a crazy soccer schedule at his school all year. I'm waiting. They're into their tournament. They're into the tournament now, so hopefully it'll end with them winning. Obviously, I can't root for my son's team not to win, even though there's been just way too many games this month of October. Rooting for them to win, but as soon as that season is over, I'm going to send an email to the school and the athletic director, and I'm going to mention the story of Ray Dennison. I have the email prepped, ready to go. So thank you for making me aware of that story. But now I want to go ahead and give you an open mic to talk about whatever you'd like to talk about, because you have been kind enough to answer all the questions that I have put to you, and you were kind enough to come back on the podcast.
Yeah, no problem. Hell, just something that kind of came to mind as you were talking there, Ben, about backups that can't play to the level of starters. It one of my many pet peeves these days is the same same as it is in every football season. Honestly, it's the next man up mentality, and everybody says next man up when you have a starter go down. Like Riley Leonard goes out for the NC State game. Well, it's next man up. Henry Beeland's got to be as good as Riley Leonard. That is the stupidest phrase we use in sports. If the next man was as good as the starter, then he'd be the starter. There's no, like, yes, you expect that guy to go in and perform. You want that. Like, that's the way the plan works. And you want all the cliches about, that guy's got to prepare like he's the starter because he's one play away from being the starter. But the whole next man up thing, just, it diminishes the roles that are established through months of practices and training and everything that goes into building what an actual depth chart looks like. To just say, oh, well, Graham Barton's out, Brian Parker, he's the next man up. He's got to go in there and be as good as Graham Barton. Graham Barton's going to be a first-round pick or second-round pick. Do you really think Brian Parker, a second-year player who is just kind of learning college football still, is going to go in there and perform at a level of Graham Barton? It's just silly to me. I think I don't know an alternative. Like, I don't know if, I don't know another phrasing of it, but I just think that let's please try to move away from using next man up. Talk about guys filling, like, their reserves. They know their place. They know where they stand. It's not insulting to say that a backup is a backup. A reserve is a reserve. When those guys get in there, don't just say, oh, well, he's the next man up. That's what he should do. No, it's great if he goes in there and plays well, like Brian Parker did against Notre Dame. When they don't play well, I mean, it's not because they weren't ready. It's because they're not as good as the guy that's in front of them. It's kind of simple.
And I think that maybe the focus should be a little bit different to just say, just come in and do your job. Don't chase the big play. Don't try to make the big play constantly, like we talked about with trying to get the strip on the tackle and everything and get the ball loose. Just do your job, make a play. You don't have to make a great play. Don't make a mistake. Okay. Just let it come to you. And I think maybe this is one of the frustrations, and I'm sure you see this covering both Wake and Duke, is that margin is thin for the bench. I mean, it's not like a place like, well, I mean, Clemson has no excuse really for the struggles that it's having this year. It's much easier to recruit there. You can get a lot of the higher, to the extent stars matter, you can get a lot of those guys there and load them up. it's so hard at places like Duke and Wake Forest. And I think what we're seeing now is, unfortunately, these injuries are just starting to catch up a little bit. And when you've got a guy like Leonard who can kind of do everything for your offense, it's just very hard to replace that, especially when you're turning to two young guys like Beelan and now what could be Loftus. And we'll see what they can do. It's really hard to do. And I think that's where it comes back on the coaches. Like what you said about Wake Forest, you've got to simplify the game plan, scale it back some, and make it as easy as possible.
Yeah, and it's that's I talked about the tough pill to swallow with Wake's defense being as good as they are. The other tough pill is they did have an experienced backup that they went to in Michael Kern. They benched Mitch Griffiths in the first half at Virginia Tech in a game they lost, and Michael Kern came in and he got them a few sustained drives. They struggled in the red zone. They had a drop pass right at the end of the first half that really made it a little bit of a different game going into halftime. But he's a fifth-year guy that spent longer behind Sam Hartman than Mitch Griffiths spent. And at the end of the Virginia Tech game, when it's 30-13 and the outcome is long decided, he gets sacked and has a shoulder injury. So even when you have that experienced backup quarterback, like Michael Kern was a luxury that disappeared in the same game that he actually got his chance to go in there and be Wake's quarterback. Sometimes that stuff happens.
Yeah, and it's frustrating. It's hard to reload and rebuild at places like Duke and Wake, but hopefully this game will be real good. It would be a really good one to watch. One programming note, as I mentioned earlier in the season, we are going to have a North Carolina coach on for the Carolina game preview. So we've got that confirmed. We've got the date locked down. It's going to happen. I'm not going to say who it is, but y'all will enjoy it, I promise. So with that in mind, Conor, thank you again for coming back on the podcast. You all know where to follow us, bullcitycoordinators.com, at Duke FB coverage. Please call into the podcast, 540-632-0160. Leave us a message or send us an email, bullcitycoordinators@gmail.com. And as always, go Duke.